Hey everybody, welcome to week 4 of the class. I hope that you are all doing well and getting the hang of things, getting the rhythm of things. One thing just to let you know, for the first few weeks when I had the video assignments set up, I didn't really make any requirements, so you technically kind of could have just glanced at it or moved past it, just not scored on it. But that will change moving forward. I'll be totally honest in that I goofed the last week or two. Usually those are set up so that you have to finish that assignment and submit it before it will unlock the next thing. And that hasn't been set up specifically that way, but it's going to be that way moving forward. So again, I'm going to encourage you to get to that video early. I was kind of surprised at how many people are waiting until Thursday to do it. So, again, the idea is to get it done, get it out of the way, and then you can move on into the materials. I sent out the plagiarism thing and the announcements and all of that. So again, I take that stuff really seriously. So please don't do it. Do honest work. If you're using other sources or you're doing it, you have to either quote it and cite it, or change the wording. Please double check all of that. Review the announcement that I sent out on that where it says important, please read, and a lot of you didn't. Also, again, it's when I send out the announcements, they're important, and I put things in there. For example, there's a little over 40 of you in the class. I think only like 16 people replied to the one and got the extra credit. Free points that I put in there. So they're worth checking out and reading. Shouldn't take too long. You should have your Canvas set up so that you get announcements, notifications on your phone, or even emailed to you so that you know what's going on. I know a lot of folks do that. I do that. So that's how I can keep on top of everything. All right. So let's get into the material. Let me see if I can make this video a little bit shorter. I may have mentioned this in the past, but I have had students in the past ask me about the books on the bookshelf behind me. The first top couple of shelves are like a lot of classical stuff and all of that, and then below there's a lot of rock books and things. There is a suggested reading or a Shane's reading list down at the bottom of your in the module if you're ever interested and you're looking for some books to read. There's a few that I really highly recommend, and then if I put it on there, it's definitely worth the read. So we have been moving through the class. We started off with blues, and you've learned about blues and ragtime and jazz and country and gospel and doo-wop and all of these that led us into rock and roll. And you learned that the term rock and roll, as I mentioned last week, and it's in the materials, was really a safe term, an acceptable term for rhythm and blues. Rhythm and blues had a connotation of being black music, and certain folks in certain places weren't real keen on that. And so Alan Freed, he didn't coin the term rock and roll, but he certainly popularized it across the races, if you will, and made it kind of a safe term. A modern version of that, or more recent version of that, to me, would be the term hip-hop. Hip-hop was not really a musical term in the beginning. It was more a cultural term. So it was that scene that came out in the late 70s and early 80s, out of the Bronx, out of New York, and the music of that scene was rap. And really early days, everybody knew that hip hop was the culture, rap was the style of music. But in the later 80s and early 90s, when gangster rap came out, and you had folks like NWA and Public Enemy and other things, and rap started to get more of a bad reputation. A lot of people hated it in the beginning because it wasn't particularly musical, and it was based a lot on sampling of other people's music. But then when it started getting more violent and crass and all that sort of stuff, and that's really when the term hip hop started being used more. And I really believe that a big chunk of the reason for that was because hip hop is a safer term. It was more race neutral or white acceptable or whatever you want to call it. So we saw that certainly with rock and roll. You learned about Elvis Presley, who was the big game changer, or one of the big game changers. You learned about Sam Phillips, who also was one of the big game changers, because as a producer, to be producing primarily black artists with his record labels, and then starting Sun and producing Elvis, and then Carl Perkins and Jerry Lee Lewis, Johnny Johnny Cash and the likes. He really changed the game, changed the playing field in the music business, socially, culturally. I'm interested in reading your assignments. That you just turned in, because when I ask you about things like, what was the social impact of, that means there is a social impact. I wouldn't ask you a question like that if there isn't one. Just like I wouldn't ask you a question about, do you see any examples today of, if I say that, it's because they're out there. And if you're not aware of them, go looking. Some of you in the last assignments were like, yeah, I don't really listen to that kind of music, so I don't know about it. Now is the time to dig in, because I'm not going to just say, oh, okay, because the music's out there. The playlists are out there. You can find them on Spotify. You can find them on YouTube. It's easy to do that. And the idea is to expand, our musical horizons. And so, I'm interested to see how many of you caught really the racial impact of what Elvis did in a positive way. It was really, really significant. And it was covered in the materials, and certainly covered even more in the modules in Canvas. Okay, so what happens is you get rock and roll, it explodes, right? 54, 55, 56, really by 56, it's becoming a big deal. And you've got, Little Richard, Chuck Berry, Elvis, Jerry Lee Lewis, Carl Perkins, as I mentioned, Buddy Holly, all of those. And then in 1959, on February 3rd, you've got the day the music died, which was that plane crash that killed the Big Bopper, Ritchie Valens, and Buddy Holly. You had Elvis getting drafted. You had Chuck Berry getting arrested. You had Little Richard quitting rock and roll to become a preacher. And Jerry Lee Lewis got in trouble because he married his cousin and who was 13. And all these things, were going on. And so rock and roll faded. It was really, a short-lived thing. And by the time you get to 59, or so, it really faded out. And what came up in its place is what we call teen-style rock and the teen idol pop. And so all of that came out. And what you started to see was basically the music business realized, hey, there's a market here for these young teenagers. For the first time, you have these young folks that had money of their own, disposable income, and they were spending it on food, on clothing, on music. And so they started to be very deliberately marketed to. And this is really where you start to see this change. I talked about this some in the last video. And so as a result of that, when rock and roll faded a bit, and then the music business got in and said, hey, we got to fill this gap. And they overlapped. Again, it's not like, one day one thing happened and the next day that happened. Just like when we study history a lot and we say, oh, well, this was in this year and this was in this year. It's not like history knows the date and then it makes these clean breaks, right? So what happens is the music business says, look, we got this gap to fill. Let's start bringing in these artists to really appeal to these teenagers, specifically teenage girls. And that's really the role that teen idol pop played. So when you had Fabian and Frankie Valli and Paul Anka and folks like that, you're going to learn about them. They came in to fill that, and they filled a very specific role musically, but they also filled a specific role socially. And I'm not going to go in that a whole lot because it's in the materials, it's in the book, and I want you to dig that out. Don't go dig it out of Wikipedia and copy it and paste it like some of you did recently. But it's fine to do the research and to add to it, but everything you need to know to do well on these assignments and to get a good grade is in your book and in the online materials, okay? So you're going to learn about Teen Idol Pop. You're going to learn about the Brill Building, which was a particular place in New York, connected, believe it or not, to Tin Pan Alley, where you had these songwriters. And back in those days, remember I showed you last week the records. Back in those days, it was very rare for artists to perform their own songs, particularly white artists. Chuck Berry did his own music, Little Richard did his own music and other things. But on the white side of things, on the pop side of things, you typically had you had songwriters, composers, and lyricists. And more often than not, it was two different people. So you had one person wrote the words and one person wrote the music. that's, if any of you are Elton John fans, it's Elton John was the same way. Later on, he just does the music, and Bernie Taupin writes the lyrics. And so with the Brill Building, you had Lieber and Stoller, and you had Jerry Goffin and Carole King, and you had these partnerships that worked. And Carole King was like, you're going to start learning about her here with Will You Still Love Me Tomorrow, which really pay attention to that song and pay attention to Be My Baby, because there's going to be questions related to that. And I want you to really dig in and think about what those songs are about. And so these songwriters would write these songs, and then they would give them to producers, and then they would get them to artists. And you had these A&R people, artists and repertoire. So they were basically the guys, and mostly guys at the time, that matched the songs with the artists, and then these producers could come in. So out of that, you're going to learn about Phil Spector, who was a pretty dubious character, but extremely important in the music business. And he's one of the first of many characters that are in there that, it's okay to admire what they did professionally, but you don't necessarily want to admire how they were as humans, right? There's a lot of people out there. We have a tendency to idolize people, and sometimes people are just kind of rotten bad people, and we don't really want to idolize them. Spector is definitely one of those, but extremely important. Would go on to influence the Beach Boys and Bruce Springsteen and the Ramones and many people. So you're going to learn about Spector. You're going to learn about his production technique known as the wall of sound. So make sure that you're paying attention. There's stuff in the materials and in text and online that talk about the wall of sound. That's really important. And then you're going to learn about the surf music scene. And that was really a West Coast thing. So really all across the country, you had the explosion of popular songs named after dances or featuring a style of dance. The twist being the most famous of all of them. But you had the pony and the alligator and all of those. And you're going to learn about those. And then on the West Coast, there was an instrumental style of dance music known as surf music. And it's just like what it sounds. It was really based a lot about around surfing. Now, the beginning of it, with the Ventures, who came out of Tacoma, Washington, definitely not a surf place at all. But they were influenced by the guitarist Duane Eddy, and they started these instrumental styles, a lot of either saxophone or electric guitar feature on the melody, instrumentals, so no words. And then you end up getting, the Shantays with Pipeline. You start getting that, and then that leads us into the Beach Boys. The Beach Boys were hugely significant because, one, they wrote and performed their own music. That was a big deal at the time. And they were big. They had kind of a niche audience early on, but they were very big and very popular. And they were both influenced by the Beatles and influencing the Beatles. They had other influences as well. So there's this direct link from the Beach Boys to the Beatles. And the Beatles and influenced by Beach Boys, and then Bob Dylan really changed the game completely. And they influenced each other as well. And you'll learn more about that coming up soon. So I want you to really dig into the Beach Boys. Beach Boys are, without a doubt, one of my favorites. Brian Wilson is just a genius. And when you get to, especially learning about the album Pet Sounds and the influence that had, it's a big deal. So yeah, one module this week. So that means one quiz, one discussion, one reflection observation. Again, just to reiterate, because of the way Canvas works, you see the final due date for the discussion, but just know that every week your initial post is due by the end of the day on Thursdays. And so I want you to keep on top of that. That's why I send the reminders out on Thursday mornings. So make sure that you're checking that, because you do get marked down points if it's late. I think that's it. My goal is to keep this under 15 minutes. Done. So have a great week. Reach out if you have questions. And just to give you a heads up, not only do you have your concert report, but next week, you're going to have the first of your 3 big tests coming up. So make sure you're really paying attention and doing good learning. That's it. Have a great one. We'll talk soon.